Hey everyone. So in this video, I'm going to give you a brief summary of what you can expect to see on the final, as well as a couple of generic study tips and exam writing tips. So in front of you, you can see the exam outline. There's going to be 9 questions, and in red, I've provided the mark breakdown, and in case you don't want to do the math, 74 marks is the total number of marks available. The first thing I'm going to do is say a few words about each of these questions. Question 1, it's going to be some sort of induction question, whether you use simple induction, complete induction, or structural induction, whether it's about strings or sequences or numbers, it's going to be some sort of induction question. In question 2, I'm going to give you an algorithm or ask you to write your own, and then ask you to analyze the runtime of that algorithm. Keep in mind here that the master theorem might apply, but it also might not apply. Question 3 is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to give you a recursive definition of a function, and I'm going to ask you to find the closed form expression of that function using repeated substitution. If you're sitting there thinking, well, why can't we use master theorem to figure out the closed form? You need to review the master theorem. Question 4 is going to be a big algorithm question. I'm going to either give you an algorithm or I'm going to ask you to write your own, and then I'm going to ask you to prove that your algorithm is correct, and I'm going to ask you to prove that it terminates as well. And keep in mind that you can prove correctness and termination for both recursive and iterative programs. Question 5, I've left the description kind of vague. It's going to be about the definition of regular languages in some way or another. I would say that question 5 is going to be one of those questions where you really have to think about what regular languages are. Question 6 is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to give you some language definitions in English, and I'm going to ask you to either write regular expressions or DFAs or NFAs for these languages. Question 7, I'm going to ask you to draw a DFA, but I'm also going to ask you to prove things about the DFA. So for example, a proof of correctness of the DFA, or a proof that the DFA is minimal. Question 8, I'm going to ask you to prove that a language is not regular, and I'll give you a hint right now that question 8 is going to be very similar to either the example we saw in class, the example in the course notes, or the question that you did on the challenge. And question 9 is going to be something else. But keep in mind that even though I've written 3 question marks here, question 9 is not harder than any of the other questions. So as long as you study well, you'll be just as prepared to answer question 9 as any of the previous 8 questions. Okay, now let's move on to some study tips. Tip number 1, and arguably more important than all the other tips put together, practice. You will not learn by reading the course notes. You will not learn by looking at the notes you took during lecture. You will not learn by Googling topics and looking at other people's lecture notes or slides or videos. All of these things are good to help you get information, but in order to actually internalize it, to be able to use this information on the final exam, you have to do questions on your own. And only by getting stuck and then asking for help, only by making mistakes and then realizing what mistakes you make, will you actually learn the course material. There are tons of practice questions in my course notes. There's lots more in Vassos' course notes. Past offerings of this course still have their web pages up. And of course, you also have the final exam bank. I guarantee you that many of the questions on the final exam, if not all of them, will be questions you've done before in this course on a midterm or problem set, or they're very similar to questions that have been asked before on previous finals, or midterms, or problem sets. On the flip side, learn from your past mistakes. Look at all of the work you've handed in at this point, whether it was preliminaries, challenges, or your midterms. Look at your work, look at the TA's feedback, and then compare your work to my solutions, even if you got perfect. Chances are you made at least one mistake in this course. Making mistakes is fine. It's actually really good because it's part of the learning process. Now you have to learn from your mistakes. And you can do that by going through your past work, not just reading the mistakes you made and figuring out why they're wrong, but also figuring out why you made that mistake. What gap in your understanding led to that mistake being made. But sometimes you'll need extra help. And you can always talk to your friends who are also in this course. You can talk to your friends who have taken this course already. And you can use Piazza and come to office hours. Make use of them. Whether it's you want to come and ask me questions about your old mistakes to figure out what went wrong, or you're working on some practice questions and you've gotten stuck and you want to ask me about that. I've noticed a student has actually taken my advice and started a Share LaTeX project to compile some solutions to my course note exercises. And I think that you, watcher of this video, should get on that. Oh, and by the way, a great way to see how your studying is going and how much you understand the material is by answering other students' questions. And the last thing to keep in mind as you're doing your studying is you are allowed to bring in a double-sided cheat sheet. The three things that I would put on for sure are any of the summation formulas we've used in this course, the master theorem, and maybe the definition of regular languages. I would also put in the definition of DFAs and NFAs as well. But one thing that I found whenever I had an exam with a cheat sheet is I barely used my cheat sheet at all during the exam, other than to look up some definitions. So my recommendation to you is not to cram in as much as you can on the cheat sheet. Use the creation of a cheat sheet as a learning opportunity. Decide what's important in this course, what questions might David ask on the final, what are some common mistakes that I might make on the final, and what tips and tricks should I remember for the final. Keep in mind that in general, there's actually very little memorization in this course. And if you think that there's a lot of memorization in this course, you're not approaching the material with the right attitude. And finally, some tips for when you actually write the exam. First of all, relax. The exam's in the morning. Get a good night's sleep, wake up early, eat a good breakfast. Have some chocolate, treat yourself. When you begin the exam, read through all the questions first before writing. This isn't just so that you know what to expect, it's also to let you be strategic. Most people I know, including myself, like to get the easy questions out of the way to build confidence. At the beginning of this video, I gave you a description of 8 of the 9 questions. Some of them are definitely going to be easier than others. So, as you're studying, figure out what you're good at, and do those questions first. And finally, don't write too much. On the challenges, we ask for a lot of details because you have the time, and we want to see really a complete understanding. But we know that an exam situation is very different from a problem set situation. You have a limited amount of time, you don't have a lot of extra resources at your disposal. So even though it's important to answer questions completely, you can expect that we'll be more generous if you leave out a few details in your solutions. One of the biggest strategic mistakes in midterm 2 was students would spend a huge amount of time on one of the questions writing paragraphs and paragraphs for an answer, and then not have enough time for the other question. There's decreasing marginal benefit the more you write for one particular question. There are 9 questions. As a rule of thumb, aim to spend around 15 minutes per question on the first run-through. Some questions you won't be able to finish in 15 minutes, and that's okay, because if you've studied well, there will be some questions on the exam that you can finish in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. But if you find yourself spending more than 15 minutes of pure writing on one particular question, stop. Maybe write a note to yourself, this is what I have left to do, and then move on. Okay, and last part of this video. Don't worry about your mark. Don't worry about your mark when you're studying. Don't worry about your mark when you're writing the exam. And certainly don't worry about your mark after you've written the exam, because there's really nothing left you can do at that point. The exam might be a bit long. I'll bell curve the marks if necessary, but I have a feeling that most of you will do pretty well as long as you've studied hard. So as you write the exam, don't think about how many marks you're going to get or how many marks you're going to lose. Think about the learning that you've done, the things that you've accomplished in this course. Because chances are, no matter how well or how poorly you did on the assignments, you learned something. And your learning, which is what you're going to show us on this exam, that's something to be proud of, no matter what.